You know how humans have been systematically destroying the planet for the past century or two, and now we know almost exactly how to stop doing it, but we keep doing it anyway because it's not our problem, it's our children's or our grandchildren's problem. You know who I blame for all that? Scientists, the ones who are studying climate change and informing our politicians and the general public on what's happening and how to fix it. Yeah, it's the scientists' fault. Catch-22 reads a recent headline from The Hill, Scientific Communication Failures Linked to Faster Rising Seas. I have several problems with this headline. First of all, the study that they used to support this headline does not in any way say that science communication failures are at all linked to faster rising seas. Not linked as a cause, like scientific communication failures directly led to fast rising seas, nor even linked as a general correlation, like the seas happen to rise faster as science communication failures increased. In fact, they found that scientific communication has improved over the past few decades, during which time, FYI, the sea levels have continued to rise. And second of all, even if all of that were true, that is not a catch-22. I know this because I just read the goddamn book. I already knew what a catch-22 is, but I wanted to mention that I read the book recently because it was actually really good, surprisingly great. But anyway, The Hill writes, scientists failed for decades to communicate the coming risks of rapid sea level rise to policymakers and the public, a new study has found. That has created a climate catch-22 in which scientists have soft-pedaled the kinds of catastrophic risks most easily headed off by cutting emissions. A catch-22 is a situation in which contradictory rules trap a person in an unwinnable situation, with the original example being that a pilot can get out of flying missions in a war if they're crazy, but they themselves have to ask to be grounded due to their craziness. But wanting to be grounded from flying is a very sane behavior. Therefore, no one crazy enough to qualify would possibly ask to be grounded. That's a catch-22. I guess one way you could apply it to climate change would be saying, Congress states that they will sign legislation taking drastic action on climate change only when they're directly affected. But they'll be directly affected when Washington, D.C.'s low-lying roadways are underwater and no one can get to Capitol Hill to vote. That's a catch-22. Anyway, it's a bad headline and a bad lead, and people on social media were rightfully pissed about it. I saw a lot of people pointing to millions of examples of how scientists have been desperately trying to get politicians to do anything about climate change for quite a long time. I mean, this goes as far back 1856, when women's rights activist, dog lover, and environmental science queen Eunice Newton Foote first discovered that carbon dioxide traps heat in our atmosphere. A lot of people posted a clip of Carl Sagan testifying before Congress in 1985 to explain the importance of addressing climate change immediately, which actually led me down a delightful rabbit hole that I'd like to share with you before we actually get into the actual study that Hill article was based on. I will get to that. You can watch Sagan's full comments or read the transcript. I highly recommend watching it in full. It's only 15 minutes, but here's how he wraps it up.
I'd like to close by just saying a few words on the kind of perspective that this problem, as related problems, pose to us. Here is a problem which transcends our particular generation. It is an intergenerational problem. If we don't do the right thing now, there are very serious problems that our children and grandchildren will have to face. It is also a global problem. It is no good if just one or two major industrial nations take major steps to prevent a major increase still further in CO2 and other greenhouse gases, because other nations may, through their industrial development, cause the problem by themselves. And not to say that this is inevitable, but just to give an example. The largest coal reserves on the planet are the United States, the Soviet Union, and China. China is undergoing a very major industrial development. And the burning of coal is certainly something that must be very attractive for the Chinese looking into the future. I would say that there is no way to solve this problem, even if the United States and the Soviet Union were to come to a perfectly good accord on this issue, without involving China and many other nations that will be developing rapidly in the time period we're talking about. So here is a sense in which the nations, to deal with this problem, have to make a change from their traditional concern about themselves and not about the planet and the species, a change from the traditional short-term objectives to longer-term objectives. And we have to bear in mind that in problems like this, the initial stages of global temperature increase, one region of the planet might benefit while another region of the planet suffers. And there has to be a kind of trading off of benefits and suffering. And that requires a degree of international amity which certainly doesn't exist today. I think that what is essential for this problem is a global consciousness, a view that transcends our exclusive identifications with the generational and political groupings into which by accident we have been born. The solution to these problems requires a perspective that embraces the planet and the future, because we are all in this greenhouse together. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sagan wasn't the only one to testify at this hearing. It was a hearing of the Senate Subcommittee on Toxic Substances and Environmental Oversight. He was joined by somebody from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, showing the potential impacts of global warming on food production in the U.S. and Soviet Union and Western Europe. And there were certain senators that were also testifying, like some guy named Albert Gore Jr., who promised to introduce legislation funding more research. Not sure what happened to him. But, this was in 1985, right in the middle of the reign of conservative deregulation deity Ronald Reagan. So I honestly expected that all of these pleas would go nowhere. After all, Reagan's predecessor, Jimmy Carter, famously put solar panels on the White House in 1979, only for Reagan to tear them down in 1986. So I wanted to look into it, did this committee meeting actually go anywhere? Did anything come of this? Now, this hearing occurred in the middle of an ongoing international discussion about climate change and the ozone layer in particular. At the time, that was considered one of the most obvious, pressing issues to solve. Earlier that year, there was an international discussion on what to do about the disappearing ozone layer, which led to a framework that was then used 2 years later to form the Montreal Protocol, a treaty that would phase out the production of the substances that were depleting the ozone layer, namely CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons. That was exactly the thing that Sagan was talking about, as many countries as possible coming together to agree to fix this problem that's affecting everyone, even if the fix means that some countries take a bigger hit than others. In the case of the Montreal Protocol, companies like DuPont thought that they were going to take way too much of a hit since they relied on the production of ozone-wrecking substances like Freon to make their massive profits. So DuPont also testified before Congress, arguing that the science was just made up and that the alternatives to CFCs were too expensive. Now, at this point, DuPont was actually pretty confident that the deregulation-happy Reagan administration would side with them, to the point that they went from spending millions of dollars researching CFC alternatives during the Carter years to spending practically nothing on that research once Reagan was elected. But surprisingly, Reagan was not on their side. Documents declassified in 2015 revealed that Reagan actually had to work with the EPA to overrule his own cabinet in order to push through ratification of the Montreal Protocol. While DuPont was able to weaken the treaty somewhat, the Montreal Protocol became one of the most successful, if not the most successful, environmental mitigation effort the world has ever undertaken. The ozone is recovering now, and it's expected to recover completely by 2066. And the EPA estimates that the Montreal Protocol will ultimately prevent 280 million cases of skin cancer, approximately 1.6 million skin cancer deaths, and more than 45 million cases of cataracts in the United States among individuals born between 1890 and 2100. Thanks, Reagan. God, I know these rabbit holes lead me to weird places, but who would have guessed this one would end up with me giving props to Ronald Reagan? So what happened to politicians listening to scientists and caring about stuff? Well, where DuPont and big CFC ultimately failed, big oil has committed themselves to succeed. Following the Montreal Protocol in the late 80s, the fossil fuel industry kicked their propaganda machine into overdrive, pouring vast amounts of money into their marketing and their science to convince the general public that climate change isn't real, and to either convince the politicians of the same or simply buy them off. Their efforts paid off. As a study found 2 years ago, every time the US government introduced serious legislation to fight climate change, big oil launched a massive counterattack to stop it. As I said back then, when the researchers laid the popularity of claim number 4 out over time, they noticed spikes in that messaging at interesting points in American political history. So if you look at this chart, point A is 2003, when Senators John McCain, a Republican, and Joseph Lieberman, a Democrat, introduced the first Climate Stewardship Act, which would have capped CO2 emissions at the level they were at in the year 2000. Plus, they would have provided a scholarship for people studying climatology. Wouldn't that have been nice? That act died in committee after the fossil fuel industry funded a report that said it would have negative economic effects on the United States. Points B and C were the follow-up 2005 and 2007 bipartisan Climate Stewardship and Innovation Acts, which was essentially the same as the first act, just reintroduced to new Congresses in the hopes that one would finally approve it. Both died in committee despite vast popular voter support. Point D is the Climate Security Act of 2007, another cap-and-trade bill that would have limited emissions. The act died due to its inability to overcome a Republican filibuster after outlets like the Washington Post ran statements from fossil fuel CEOs saying that the bill would be economically devastating. Point E is the Waxman-Markey bill, aka the American Clean Energy and Security Act, another cap-and-trade bill that came to a Democrat-held Congress in 2009 and actually passed in the House. It was never even brought to the floor in the Senate after the conservative think tank, the Heritage Foundation, wrote a report claiming that passage of the bill would lead to an energy crisis. Finally, point F is when President Obama introduced the Clean Power Plan in 2015, an initiative that provided each state with a goal of reducing their carbon emissions however they wanted. Congressional Republicans tried to block the plan, with groups like Americans for Prosperity arguing that the plan would have a, devastating effect on the economy. And Donald Trump just did away with that plan when he took office, But do you see the pattern? Every time the United States had a chance to pass legislation that the IPCC says is necessary for the survival of the human race, conservative think tanks like the Heartland Institute, funded in part by the fossil fuel industry, started talking about how alternative solutions to fossil fuels simply will not work. The facts are really clear here. It's not the scientists not communicating well enough, it's capitalism. Which brings me back to this article on the Hill, and more importantly, the actual study it's based on. Communicating future sea level rise uncertainty and ambiguity to assessment users was published this week in Nature by a small team of scientists led by Robert Kopp of Rutgers Department of Earth and Planetary Sciences. They did not find or even look into the idea that poor communication on the part of scientists is linked to rising sea levels. They did find ways that scientists have improved their communication regarding the problem of sea level rise over the past few decades. They did this by looking at the IPCC reports from 1990 when they started all the way up to the latest one in 2021, which I discussed from the safety of my bed in this video. And here is what they found. In general, scientists have always been really good at communicating quantifiable risks when it comes to sea level rise. Like, scientists understand how oceans absorb heat and then expand in response. So they can say with a high degree of certainty what will happen to sea levels thanks to that known process. But there are also these ambiguous, uncertain outcomes that are much harder to predict. And in the early years of IPCC reports, scientists weren't great at communicating those more complicated ideas to the public. For instance, in 1990, the report stated that a rapid disintegration of the West Antarctic ice sheet because of global warming was unlikely in the next century. And I'm quoting the study's press release here, which, you can always find links below in the transcript over on my Patreon. The problem with that is that while it's true that it's an unlikely event, if it does occur, then the results would be catastrophic. In contrast, the press release states, in the sixth assessment report published in 2021, scientists warned that higher rates of sea level rise before 2100 could be caused by earlier than projected disintegration of marine ice shelves, the abrupt widespread onset of marine ice sheet instability, and marine ice cliff instability around Antarctica. The report goes on to explain that the processes are characterized by deep uncertainty. It concludes, in a low likelihood, high impact storyline under high emissions, such processes could, in combination, contribute more than 1 additional meter of sea level rise by 2100. The authors suggest that this new way of framing risk is better for the public to understand what's going on, and that people should get a balanced presentation of both quantifiable risks and also those unknowns in order to make better policy decisions going forward. Because while a certain event might be unlikely, it could also be devastating, and it could also be easily avoided by doing certain actions now. For instance, it's very unlikely that you're going to die from a lightning strike, but if you did, it would really suck. And there are ways to significantly reduce your chances of encountering that rare event, like not taking your metal boat out onto the lake and going fishing during a thunderstorm. The authors conclude by noting that they don't know if this method really will improve policymaking decisions or public perception of climate change. The most recent report just came out not even 2 years ago, so we have to wait and see, and also someone needs to pay attention and collect the data and analyze it. But this is important work for science communicators, and not just those talking about sea level rise. Pretty much every discipline has trouble with helping the public understand ambiguity, like DNA researchers trying to tell the general public that they don't necessarily need to freak out if they have a certain gene mutation, or biologists helping the general public understand that scientific disagreement over certain aspects of how evolution works doesn't invalidate the theory of evolution. People have trouble with the idea of being unsure about something, or with changing their mind as new evidence comes in, or with statistics just in general. That's the root of conspiracy theories and magical thinking and superstition. And it's how big industries like fossil fuel companies can manipulate the public into believing something that is untrue. I'm glad that these researchers are finding better ways to communicate complicated ideas. I just wish our media would do a better job at communicating that. Looking at you, The Hill. I guess you could say this is a real catch-22, because that means whatever you want it to mean. Oh, hey, sorry, I almost forgot. But before you go, and while we're discussing climate change, I wanted to give a quick plug to a dumb thing I'm doing. Later this year, I'm going to be riding my bicycle hundreds of miles across Death Valley as a way to raise money for charities fighting climate change, like the California Bicycle Coalition and others. If you would like to support this completely ridiculous fundraiser, you can go to support.climateride.org/participants/Rebeccawatson. The link is in the transcript linked below if you don't want to type all that out. If you can't or don't want to throw monetary support, I understand, no worries. Please just help me out. Do me a favor, let me know in the comments your best tip for training to do a physical activity that I'm pretty sure is going to kill me. Thanks. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.